thank you, Miles, for hosting the session and moderating today. And my name is John Benjamin. I am a teacher naturalist at the Harris Center for Conservation Education, where Miles and I both work, based in Hancock, New Hampshire. I'm sure many of you hopefully know about the Harris Center already and got plugged into this class through your awareness of all kinds of programs that go on there now. And I'm going to dive right into our topic today, which is the introduction to the world of reptiles. We're going to kind of have an overview of what reptiles are, how they evolved. I'm going to introduce you to some scientific terminology and even some, phylogenetic trees, things that might seem a little bit like, whoa, maybe kind of fancy science, but I hope I can, show you how it all fits in context. And today is going to be an introduction really to just reptiles in general. So I do want this to be focused on, a lot of New England reptiles, ones that I find. Both these photos are ones that I took of reptiles that I found. The first one is a red-bellied snake. And these are common little snakes in New England. I found this with students, actually. We were removing invasive plants, and a 10th grader found this in the root system of a plant we were moving. So awesome little native snake there, eats slugs and snails. And then, of course, we have a young snapping turtle that I saved from the road. That this time of year is a pretty common thing to see snappers traveling across roads, especially females looking for nesting sites. So I always try to help these guys out. And this guy was a little more aggressive here. I had to be careful moving him across the road. So I'll be sharing a number of my own photos, but I've also just used the internet to gather a lot of these photos as well for you today. So let's see if we can go to the next slide. Maybe. Here we go. Okay, let's do the overview of classes here. Just give you a little rundown of where we're going to be going. Today's our Introduction to Reptiles class. So we're going to talk about kind of a number of things. The taxonomy, which is kind of how they're related, which is, of course, similar to the evolution. How reptiles all evolved over time. It's a very interesting story. So we'll be getting into that a bit today, and I hope you'll find it as interesting as I do. The anatomy, there's some of their physical adaptations they all have in common. A little bit about behavior. We'll get more into that when we get into the sort of more detail with the snakes and turtles that we'll be talking about in the coming weeks. And ecology is the word I keep throwing out, which is really just the science of connection. So really any organism that you're looking at, of course, you're talking about ecology. What does it eat? What eats it? How does it fit in with the environment? So of course, that is important to talk about. Any group of organisms is the relationships they have. And then class 2, we will get more detail into snakes, and especially snakes of New Hampshire. So we'll kind of have a profile on all our local species and how to ID them, and a little bit more about their ecology and conservation status as well. And for class 3, same thing with turtles. We'll be kind of delving into our local turtle species and turtles in general, and just talking more about some of their conservation issues and ecology and things like that. So that's kind of our overview. And today, I'll start with the question, what are reptiles? Because that's a pretty good place to start. And this is a page that's going to have a lot of vocabulary on it, some new terminology. So if you're the kind of person that likes to take notes, if you want to learn, you could do that. You can certainly get this PowerPoint later. But I'm going to kind of break it down, how reptiles fit into the world of life and animals and kind of what makes them unique. So scientifically speaking here, let's start with the kingdom, Animalia. So they are animals, they are not plants, they are not fungi. So of course we have the animal kingdom here. And what does that mean really? Well, here's a bunch of words for you. They are eukaryotic, which means our cells have membranes around the nucleus, so we can keep all our DNA and chromosomes in there, as well as little organelles. And really eukaryotes are all animals and plants and fungi are eukaryotes. That was an important step in the evolutionary history of developing multicellular life, which means cells glomming together and forming superorganisms of multiple cells that are all specialized. And you had to have eukaryotes with all of these, especially the efficiency of holding the DNA in, and also having their powerhouse little mitochondria in the case of animals. So that is what allows a lot of energy to be used by the cell much more efficiently, and then you get all kinds of cool possibilities with how cells can work together. So that's a little bit nerdy, and I know it goes back in evolutionary history, but that's kind of what defines what makes animals animals. So we're going to kind of start from the beginning. So they're eukaryotic cells, multicellular, and heterotrophic. Animals have to eat stuff. Animals do not have chloroplasts. We cannot use sunlight to produce our own carbohydrates. So we are considered heterotrophs. Hetero is outside. Trophic is effectively eating. So we eat stuff from the outside. We got to find food. And motile, we can move around, unlike most kinds of fungi, which are also heterotrophic, but they can't you know, just fly or crawl from one place to another. They have other ways of moving around, fungi. That'll be another ESI class in the future, I hope. So let's move right on. So we have our animal kingdom, of course, but now let's talk about the next step. The phylum is Chordata, which is all the animals that have a backbone. They're called vertebrates with backbones and internal skeletons. So this separates out all the invertebrates of the world, the huge, diverse group of animals that don't have backbones. So we're getting into the more familiar animals. Of course, we are vertebrates and a member of the phylum Chordata. So reptiles, absolutely, even snakes, they have internal skeletons, they have backbones, and a lot of people don't always realize that because snakes are so slithery, like a worm, and kids are like, nah, I don't have a skeleton, or maybe adults, but they absolutely do. All reptiles are vertebrates. And I should also mention that they are tetrapods. I think I forgot that word there. T-R-A-P-O-D, which means they have 4 legs. So they evolved from those first lobe-finned fish that crawled out of the, water habitats, not all at once like you see in cartoons, but, with the sort of 4 limbs that became the sort of model for all vertebrates. So, of course, we're tetrapods too, and so are birds and all mammals and reptiles and amphibians. All tetrapods. But let's go into the class Reptilia now. So really, let's get into what makes reptiles unique from other animals and even other vertebrates. So, okay, there's the word tetrapod, 4-legged. And then this is an important word, actually, in how to think about animals and their evolutionary history, and that is the word amniote, which is the name for any animals that have an amniotic membrane surrounding the embryo while it is developing. And that is one of the big steps that makes reptiles different from amphibians, because amphibians have those soft, transparent eggs with no shell and no amniotic membrane. So they have to stay in wet habitats or they dry out. That's an really important sort of limitation for amphibian reproduction. Reptiles were the first creatures that evolved to be amniotes, and mammals were also amniotes. But in reptiles, that membrane is inside the shell, and that just keeps the water in. There's all kinds of fancy gas exchange and things like that have to happen through the membrane. But effectively, this protects the embryo and allows the animal to then inhabit drier habitats because the eggs can survive in dry places. They don't need to stay moist all the time. So this was a big step in evolutionary history, having this membrane. And then the shelled eggs was another addition to that. So reptiles can lay their eggs in very dry habitats, and that little embryo can be protected in there due to the fact that they are amniotes. And then mammals, of course, have the amniotic membrane, inside the placenta, inside the female as it's growing. But again, that's a linkage in our evolutionary histories that separates from amphibians and fish and other vertebrates. And now, this is a word you might recognize. Another common characteristic of reptiles is they are ectothermic, which means their body temperature is regulated by the environment. So they are always at the exact same temperature as the air or the water around them, which is why you often see reptiles basking, very commonplace, especially in New Hampshire. So snakes in the sunny field or on your driveway or even in a road because they're trying to warm their bodies up, bring it up to that high temperature where they have the energy to be active. So on slow days, on cold days, reptiles are slow. If you want to catch a snake, often it's easy, best time is to go out early in the morning when they're just coming out and the sun hasn't really warmed them up yet, and they're kind of slow. You can get them more easily if you're into that kind of thing. So all reptiles are ectothermic. Cold-blooded is the common phrase that most people know, but it's a little bit of a misleading term. Really, all it means is their temperature is the same as the environment. Us mammals and birds are endothermic. We use our metabolism to raise our body temperature above the environment. We have to eat a lot more food because of that. So one of the advantages of being ectothermic is you don't need to eat very much, and you can conserve a lot more energy and wait out times of not having food. Reptiles are really good at that. I would say especially snakes. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But yep, that's sort of a difference between the endothermic strategy of you gotta eat a lot all the time, find your food, keep your body temperature up, versus an ectotherm where they can just hunker down when they need to. But of course, if it gets too cold, they can die because they can't keep their temperature above the environment. So that's why reptiles and amphibians hibernate, try to get below the frost line, find ways of lowering their body temperature in systematic ways. We'll talk more about hibernation when we get more into snakes and turtles of New Hampshire. But there's kind of an overview, a little bit about what reptiles are, some of these terms that really define how they fit into the tree of life and the animal kingdom. So I think we're going to move right on.
John, I got a quick question for you.
Yes, please.
You talked about reptiles being tetrapods, but what about snakes?
Ooh, all right, fantastic. So snakes as we know, don't have legs, but their ancestors did. Snakes are effectively a specialized group of lizards, and all of them evolved from four-legged animals. And there's all kinds of cool little signs on snakes that show how their ancestors were tetrapods. So again, when you talk about evolution and evolutionary history, it's all about your lineage. It's all about what you're related to. So even though they've evolved to not have legs, there's many kinds of lizards that also don't have legs. I'll show you, hopefully today we'll have time to get into some of the weird variations of snakes and lizards that even are still alive today. It's not all so simple as snakes and lizards, and that's all. There's all kinds of weird, we call them squamates. But the answer is snakes used to have legs, 4 legs, and that's why we call them tetrapods, based on their evolutionary lineage. And it was only pretty recent that they evolved to not have legs. And we'll talk more about that as we move along.
Cool, thank you.
Cool, absolutely. Thank you, Miles, for jumping in there. That was great. And whoever asked that question. All right, so moving right along, let's talk about the study of herpetology is the name of the scientific study of reptiles and amphibians. And just this word really shows a little bit about kind of the history of how humans have viewed reptiles and amphibians, and really kind of we haven't really given them all the attention and observation until kind of recent times that they deserve. And effectively, the Latin root of the word herp means creeping thing, i.e. herpes, right? So I mean, this is not a very generous terminology, and the early scientists, when they were first developing these different disciplines of studying animals, you had of course your mammalogy and your ornithology, pretty popular organisms for humans to study. And then when it came to the reptiles and amphibians, they were like, they both creep around, let's put them together. Herpetology, study of creeping things. Done. And we still have this sort of historical artifact of what we call it today. But the truth is that reptiles and amphibians are entirely unrelated clades of vertebrates. And we're going to get into some of the evolutionary trees and see that. But I have side by side here a lizard and a salamander. And, many children and many adults, I would say, really just have no concept that a salamander on the right, one of our latest species, the spotted salamander, has really, even though that has a tail and 4 legs and kind of similar body shape, not at all related to a lizard on the left. Here's a fence lizard. You can see those scales, and really totally different animals, as different as a bird and a mammal, and of course we wouldn't put them together, but really that's just kind of an artifact of how, we see how we paid more attention to certain groups of organisms over time, and it hasn't necessarily been a long-standing tradition of deep attention to detail. So that's kind of why we have the word herpetology today. Move on if there's no questions that pop up. Let's kind of wait for Miles to jump in. All right, so here's a very unique feature of all reptiles that differentiates them from amphibians, absolutely, and that is the scales or scutes on their body. And that is a unique adaptation of the reptile lineage. All reptiles have a form of this or another. It provides protection to their bodies and especially prevents water loss. So kind of in addition to becoming amniotes and being able to lay their eggs on land, they also evolved scales or scutes to protect their bodies from drying out. And that again gave them a huge ability to colonize new dry, harsher habitats where you wouldn't be able to have a salamander or a frog survive as easily. And of course we have reptiles in some of the most dry, harsh deserts in the world, and they have ways of surviving there and maintaining, especially preventing water loss. So we have a picture of a garter snake and a painted turtle here. You can see different types of scales. Scales have evolved in many different ways in different reptile groups. For the turtle, you can see on its back we have what are called the scutes, these big kind of flat kind of plates that cover the shell. And the snake, snake scales are very specialized. So, we'll get into this more later, but the belly scales are very unique, how they overlap and allow locomotion. And there's lots of cool details about how scales have evolved in snakes and other animals. But that is a unique feature of the reptile class. They all have some form of scales or scutes. All right. Let's get nerdy. Let's start talking about the evolutionary tree of reptiles. And I find this is a fascinating subject, so I hope I won't get too many glazed eyes here. But really, it's the story of how reptiles came to be and how they all evolved over time. And it's a messy story. It's complicated. And even today, scientists disagree about a lot of things because the evolutionary story, the fossil record, is fairly incomplete. We're so lucky to find fossils of anything. It's such a rare thing that happens when you have smaller, delicate animals like snakes and lizards, or even turtles. It's just not as likely you're going to find fossils. So we've been piecing together the story, and even in recent times, it's been totally shaken up about how they're related. But here's kind of a simple diagram that shows the history of reptile evolution in, absolutely connected to dinosaur and bird evolution. It's all wrapped together. And that's what makes it kind of a funny story. And the word I have there is, it is not considered monophyletic. And that's a fancy word that biologists use. A monophyletic group is all the living species in that group that we put in that group all have a common ancestor, and there are no outliers. There are no weird branches that you wouldn't consider in that group. And the reason that reptiles are not considered monophyletic is because at the very bottom, you'll see birds are in there. So if reptiles were going to be considered a monophyletic group, we'd have to consider birds to be reptiles because they're absolutely an outgrowth of that same lineage. And you can see here, lizards and snakes branched off. This is kind of a very simple diagram here. But one kind of interesting thing you can see here is how we have the common ancestor of crocodiles, dinosaurs, and birds, a group we call archosaurs. And what this shows us is crocodiles. You see all the things in that archosaur group, and all the way at the bottom, the only ones that are alive today are crocodilians and birds. Turns out crocodiles are the closest living relative of birds, which is very something you might not expect, right? And then you have all the other, prehistoric reptiles that went extinct at the end of the Cretaceous, the dinosaurs and pterosaurs, that are all part of the archosaur lineage as well. So, when you talk about a monophyletic group, you need to have everything kind of, part of the same evolutionary history, and we have not, because birds have always seemed so unique, and we never really had the tools or the fossil record or the genetic technology to really see how it all worked in the past. We kind of have this common terminology of birds are birds and reptiles are reptiles, but really evolutionarily that makes no sense. It's just all, if you want to call it, it's all one big clade of these reptile lineages that have common ancestors in different places. So let me get to a more detailed tree now. This one shows even the whole vertebrate, living vertebrates today, and kind of how we think they've evolved. You won't get all the the fish and that sort of thing. There's lots of stuff that happened in the early history of vertebrates and tetrapods, but kind of look to where the the tetrapod, if you can find that linkage right there. So imagine the very first lobe-finned fish that kind of evolved into land-dwelling creatures, four kind of lobes coming out, and then they start to diversify. And of course, we had the amphibians, kind of were a very early group of that. We have our salamanders and frogs, and a strange limbless group called caecilians that are all still alive today in our amphibian class of living animals. But then you have our tetrapods. You see the amniote clade that branched away from amphibians. And I mentioned how important that was with the membrane around the embryo. And then you have all these branches there. So you can see early on, actually, the mammal clade broke off from the reptile clade. And that actually happened fairly early. I mean, relatively speaking, before dinosaurs ever evolved, we had mammals that were already branching off from reptiles. And they have their own evolutionary lineage of evolving hair and, all that kind of thing. But then you have the amniote clade. That's where you want to follow the line there. And you can see all the living things today that we consider to be, in the same lineage of reptiles. And that includes birds, technically speaking. So you've got turtles, which is, we'll talk about some of these groups in more detail in just a minute. And turtles are pretty mysterious. We don't quite know how they all fit in. We'll see that in a little bit. We've got tuataras, which I'm excited to talk about, a very weird living fossil that not a lot of people know about. We've got our lizards and snakes and our crocodilians, as well as birds. And again, look how crocodilians and birds are just two little sister branches on the same, lineage there. The archosaurs and dinosaurs would be in there too, but, this is all for living animals, so they're not included in this diagram. So this is a lot of kind of, information that I hope is interesting to see how things are related, how the story of trying to understand these relationships is continuing to unfold. And, we have to have evidence from a lot of different disciplines, the fossil record especially, but also just comparative studies of living animals and genetic studies are all really helpful trying to unravel this kind of mystery of the ancient evolution of how we have these modern reptiles alive today. So it's a complicated story. Oops, play from the current slide. All right, cool. And pause for one moment. That was a lot of information. Any questions pop up here? If not, I'll move right along. Go. Miles talking.
We got a quiet group here.
Okay, no worries.
No questions.
Just processing all this awesome phylogeny. This is the good stuff here. All right, so let's move into more detail about the 4 living suborders of reptiles. So here we have yet another phylogenetic tree of reptiles. We can kind of see some of the, the common ancestors, some of these prehistoric animals, kind of the stem reptiles. I love that term there. You can follow the very beginning of the tree there on the left, the stem reptiles that kind of were the, common ancestors of all of these. The Dimetrodons, those guys with the sails you always see, were definitely not dinosaurs. In fact, that evolved into modern mammals. You kind of went through the cerapsids, and then you kind of get to all of our mammal evolution. But then you can, once again, follow the, sort of lineages of these different reptiles. And look how turtles branch off way back there. And that is a mysterious branch off. Turtles are really a wild card in our story of reptile evolution, and we don't have it figured out at all, which is, I think, is pretty cool. But then you can see, the snakes and the lizards and the tuataras all kind of came from the same lineage. And then we had our archosaurs, the dinosaurs you see there, and then the crocodiles and birds. And you can, what I like about this diagram is you can see the timeline a little bit too of where we think they branched off. So, once again, you'll have all this information when I share the PowerPoints with you. So a lot of things you can dig into here, but I really believe it's great to understand our best understanding of these evolutionary relationships, because it really informs how we can understand these animals and how they've come to be the way they are today. Let's go on to some of these different suborders. I'll try to make sure I keep track of our time here so we can have time for questions. Tuataras are super weird reptiles that many people do not know about. There's only one species that is alive today on a few remote islands in New Zealand, and they are truly a living fossil. They're one survivor of an ancient lineage of reptiles that branched off way back, like around when turtles branched off, probably, or a little later. But again, we just don't understand a lot about them, and they're unique. People see them and they look like iguanas, so you'd say, oh, it's probably just a lizard. But they have some very strange skeletal differences, and especially if you want to get the details, they have 2 rows of upper teeth on the top jaw and only 1 row on the bottom, which is different than any other living tetrapod. And they have what's called a large pineal eye, also called a third eye, on the top of their head for sensing light. And they have a very uniquely large one with a sort of gap in their skull there. But I will mention, tell you about what this is. The pineal eye is a common adaptation actually in a lot of living reptiles. So I'll show you here a picture of a common little lizard here, the Carolina anole, and you can see the pineal eye, a very small one. And this is a common feature that many reptiles have to help regulate their circadian patterns, basically based on light, and that helps them with seasons, getting ready for hibernation, when it's time to bask, all kinds of things for breeding, and it's just an extra piece of information that can be included in how they interpret their environment and dictate their behavior. So that's, many reptiles, I should say, do have that, but the tuataras have a very unique large one. So they are their own order. They are very, very endangered, very, not surprising, because they're so limited to this very small group of islands. And, any island living animal is very vulnerable to predation by things like rats and dogs, and that has been the case with tuataras. But they are still surviving, and lots of conservation measures trying to keep them going where they are still alive in these little islands in New Zealand. So that's kind of a curiosity, but I think a pretty cool one about the living story of reptiles. Let's go on to a more familiar group, the turtles and tortoises, the Testudines order, and there are 356 living species. Many of them are threatened or endangered. We're going to talk more about the conservation issues facing reptiles today as we move on, but just to mention that they're a vulnerable group for a number of reasons. All of them, as we know, possess a bony or sometimes cartilaginous protective shell, and that is developed from the rib cage of the turtle. That is important thing I always tell kids. At the very end of, when I turn off my camera, I'll show you, I actually have a big sea turtle shell I borrowed from the Harris Center. One of the other strange things that was given to us, probably some sort of confiscated, poaching byproduct or something. But it's a pretty cool artifact that does show the vertebrae connected to the shell. So we'll see more about that. And like I mentioned, turtles are one of the oldest living reptile orders, and they think they evolved about 260 million years ago. But again, it's a really murky story when it comes to turtle evolution. And I always just love to just imagine those step-by-step stages of what did it look like when an animal's ribs began to fuse and grow outside of its body and surround it. Think about what that would look like step by step, with little baby bony plates kind of starting to form, fuse together. It's a real cool thing for me to imagine that, and just such a testament to how with such deep time, evolution can just do such incredible things to animals. And turtles are a living testament to that, in my opinion. So again, we're going to get more into turtles with a future class and more about native species, but there's an overview. I mentioned this includes sea turtles are in this order, includes the biggest, heaviest reptile in the world, the leatherback sea turtle. As well as our familiar little local turtles. We got a painted turtle and a snapping turtle. I actually stole that picture on the bottom right from a Facebook post my friend made, I think this morning. He's just like, oh, found this guy on our deck today. So I'm like, well, I'll use it for my PowerPoint. and tortoises as well. So they are, you know, known for their domed shells and live in more dry habitats, not a swimming type of turtle. So don't drop a tortoise in the lake thinking it'll swim away. But again, we'll get more into turtles in a future class. So let's move to the next reptile group. Crocodilia. So we don't have any of these in New Hampshire, but they are a very unique and very cool group of living reptiles. So we have crocodiles, alligators, caimans, and what are called gharials. The bottom right, you can see a gharial there. They're, you know, native to the Indian subcontinent mostly. They've got very strange thin snouts for snatching up fish. So there are only 23 living species of crocodilians. Many, sadly, are threatened for various reasons. You know, humans don't always love living around big predators that can snag your pets. You know, the American alligator was a whole big story of they were mostly, they're poached and hunted almost to local extinction, but they were then protected and have come back with a vengeance. So we have an American alligator down in the lower left corner there, and they are, if you ever go to Florida or Georgia, places like that, swampy areas, you'll find American alligators. They have come back, and they are really, you know, relatively speaking, thriving, which is awesome. American crocodiles are another story. They're very threatened. Up in the upper right corner, we have a saltwater crocodile from Australia. It is the largest living reptile, and one that can take you out. So it's one of those unique things. There are a few places in the world where you still have reptiles on the top of the food chain, and we kind of have a little reminder of maybe how things used to be in ancient times with just lots of big reptile predators on the planet. And when I went to do Australia with my dad and my brother, I remember seeing all the signs of just, you know, don't go swimming. There are salties around. So it's a daily fact of life for people in those places. But here in New Hampshire, not so many big dangerous crocodilians to worry about. But again, the closest living relatives to birds, which I think is just very, very interesting. Moving right along. Go into the order Squamata. So we are going to definitely spend some more time talking about these reptiles. And this is lizards and snakes. They are in the same order of reptiles. And this is the largest, most successful living reptile order, over 7,400 living species. You know, snakes and lizards have really been a success story as far as how they've been able to turn into many species, colonize new habitats. And one of the secrets to their success is their skulls. All of them possess these uniquely jointed skulls, and that allows them basically to move their jaws in fancy ways, to have very good flexibility and strength, and therefore they have been able to evolve all kinds of cool dietary specializations, which means there's, you know, snakes that only eat snails. Their jaws are evolved just right to get into the shell of a snail and suck it out. And that is a specialization that allows them to occupy a new niche. So, you know, in the story of evolution, when you suddenly have some sort of a trait that is very versatile and then can open up to all kinds of you know, successes as there's little mutations in it, well, then you can have what's called the radiation of many species all being able to use that trait in unique ways and evolve into their own species. And that has definitely been the case with snakes and lizards, and the jaw has been one of the keys to that. And snakes, as we'll talk more about, they take that flexibility and strength to the extreme with how they are able to consume their prey and you know, catch their prey. The other thing that unites the squamates, as we call them, and honestly, if you really wanted to be a good nerdy scientist, you would just call any lizard or snake a squamate, because really snakes are just one family of lizards. There's really nothing that, you know, evolutionarily makes snakes different from many lizards. They just evolved to lose their legs and got really specialized jaws. Other things too that we'll talk about. I think we'll have time today. But they all shed their skin. I'll show you when we have the camera off later. I do have a nice little garter snake skin shedding here. It's not an uncommon thing to find. Snakes tend to shed their skins in one big piece at once, and lizards tend to have it more in small patches. So that is something that I'm sure a lot of you have observed before, especially snake skins here in New Hampshire. Not hard to find, especially on mountaintops. Near the Harris Center, there's a mountain called Mount Scatutiki, which I would always take kids up, hike in, and it's kind of a nice rocky, you know, sort of open summit there with lots of good basking habitat. So there's just all kinds of snake skins there, and you find, you know, milk snakes and other animals there. But if you find a lot of snake skins, it's a good indication that you have a good reptile habitat, and keep your eyes open. So too many questions pop in, otherwise I'll move right along. Okey-doke. Let's talk a little bit about snakes versus lizards, because this is a common question and one that I hear quite a bit. Again, we'll talk more about snakes of New Hampshire in our next class. But here's some of the big differences. On the upper left, there is a snake, a smooth green snake. And on the upper right is what's a type of legless lizard. It's a European species. And you might say, well, what the heck? What's the difference? Well, let's find out. So snakes have no eyelids. This is a very unique adaptation that they think, really what they think about snakes is that they evolved from a group of lizards initially as a burrowing group. They think that most early snakes were burrowing animals. There's still debate about that, but because of being in the ground, hunting for rodents in their burrows, that's why I think the legs became shrunk until the point where they were just eliminated because it was not helpful in burrows. And then the eyes, to protect them from getting grit and dirt in them, they evolved to just have these fixed scales, transparent scales that cover the eye and protect it. So that's why snakes never blink. That's one thing that I think freaked out early humans and resulted in all kinds of weird myths about, them turning you to stone and Medusa and all kinds of things because of that hypnotic, blinkless stare they have. And that's just, product of their evolutionary history. Lizards, as we'll talk about in a minute, most of them do have eyelids. Most of them blink. But for snakes, they have no external ears. Look carefully at that green snake head there, and you'll see there's no ear openings. Another byproduct of having a digging background, fossorial we call it. So you don't want to get gunk in your ears. There's no need for that. And a better way to interpret where your prey is if you're burrowing is you feel vibrations. So snakes have a very sensitive ability to feel vibrations in the ground through their jaws. And so that's more helpful for snakes than being able to hear. But they are not able to pick up sound waves through the air like animals with ears are. So no external ear openings on snakes. They have their classic forked tongue. Some lizards have that too, but it's definitely a unique thing that all snakes have. Venom is a unique thing with snakes too. Some have it. Maybe all snakes actually have some form of venom, which is kind of an interesting thing we'll talk about. This does not mean all snakes are dangerous or problematic to us, but turns out the story of venom is one that's a little more complicated than a lot of people think. But of course, for the intensive purposes right now, we're going to be really emphasizing how most snakes are harmless that we have around us here. Some snakes are constrictors. Some snakes will be able to squeeze their prey to kill them. And they are not able to regenerate their tails, which is something that differentiates them from many kinds of lizards. So then in contrast, on the lizard side of the equation here, we've got most of them do have eyelids and they can blink. So if you I always think of that classic scene in the first Harry Potter, where I don't know if any of you have seen that. Some of you have. The snake gets out of the zoo and then he winks at Harry and slithers off. And I've always just been like, oh, come on, because snakes can't. Lizards good though. So most lizards do have eyelids and they can blink to protect their eyes. Not all lizards. In fact, I'm going to show you at the end of class today a little squamate that actually lives here at our home. It is a type of gecko that we have that doesn't have any eyelids. So we'll be able to see that right in my little video camera at the end of a living example of a cool type of lizard here. But anyway, they do have external ears. Lizards you'll be able to see. You can look carefully at that legless lizard on the upper right, and you'll see those little ear openings. So that is a dead giveaway. That is not a snake right there. And most lizards have those fleshy tongues. Some lizards, like monitor lizards, like Komodo dragons, they do have forked tongues, and they're actually more related to the lineage of squamates that turned into snakes, so it kind of makes sense. But not all. Most lizards don't have that. A few lizards are venomous. There are some, like the Gila monster, I'm sure many of you have heard of, and there's a couple other ones. Most lizards definitely are not venomous. No constriction. They are not able to squeeze their prey like certain snakes are able to. And many lizards do have what's called autotomy, which is tail regeneration. So I remember as a kid, the first experience of catching a lizard, I think was out in Utah, and actually some of them can, you don't have to pull on it, it'll just constrict the muscles and it will snap right off. And then that is a defense mechanism. It will keep wiggling around, all those nerves will keep firing and the muscles twitching, and that little tail will just keep twitching around as a big distraction mechanism so that the lizard can't escape while the predator's, busy with the tail, and they are able to survive and regenerate their tail, usually. I'll show you our little gecko here actually wasn't able to do that, so he doesn't have a tail, which is kind of unusual for a lizard species. But that is something that snakes cannot do and lizards can do. So there's kind of a little bullet point list of some of the basic differences between what we call snakes versus lizards. But I will kind of remind you again that scientifically speaking, snakes are just a type of lizard, basically, just one family of lizards that evolved in a unique direction, kind of like toads are just one family of frogs. So, we have sort of common words because they look a little differently, and we've sort of inherited these words, but really, snakes are just a unique branch of the squamate, suborder, which is, just a branch off of lizards, basically. All right, so here's some examples. I think that'd be cool to look a little bit more at some of these squamates today. And then in our time here, I think we'll be looking good for having a question and answer session, or I can show you some of these things from my live camera when I'm done with the PowerPoint here. This is a weird animal from Mexico. This one really throws a cog in our sense of, was it a snake or a lizard? Well, you tell me about the Mexican mole lizard. Look at that. It has 2 little legs in the front, none in the back. It is a weird little burrowing squamate, and it is one of those kinds of ancestral kind of lineages that kind of started to lose its legs, but didn't go all the way with it like snakes did. So there's quite a few examples of that in the squamate, suborder of different lineages, not just snakes that started to lose their legs in different grades because of becoming more burrowing, more fossorial. And here's a weird, I love these little guys, ajolotes, and they are just these strange little sort of hybrids you can almost think of a snake and a lizard, but here's one more type of squamate is really the best way to think of them. And here we have a great example of a legless lizard, the Burton's legless lizard. Many lizards have evolved to become legless, but look at its head, look carefully. Can you see that clue that lets you know it's a lizard and not a snake? I bet you can. It is that little ear opening there. It's subtle, but if you really look there, yep, if it has an ear opening, it's a lizard right there. So we've got a cool legless lizard here. Here we can see it. This is an example of a lizard that doesn't have any eyelids, so they have to lick their eyes to keep them moist, just like my little gecko here does, that I'll show you at the end of our class. So you would never see a snake licking its eyeball either. All snake tongues are those, long fork tongues for picking up scent, whereas lizards often have those fleshy tongues they can use even to clean their eyeballs sometimes. So here we have another cool squamate, and here's another squamate that I think is pretty cool. Another legless lizard called a slow worm, and you can't quite see his little ear opening there, but it does have one. And this is a great example of a specialized squamate that has just unique jaws that are specialized for eating one group of animals. And in this case, these guys love slugs and snails. And actually similar to some of our little native snakes, they really specialize to eat sort of soft, fleshy invertebrates like slugs and earthworms and things like that. So here we have, but again, it's just a great example of just how like old common names can be so confusing to people to try to really understand what these animals are. And we've just kind of inherited these, systems of what we call things. But this is a European species that the common name is slow worm, which is a really just kind of a dumb, not accurate name. It's not an invertebrate, it's not a worm, but it's just kind of history of people seeing something small and legless and being like, oh, must be a worm. And then that's just passed down over time and continues to be sort of a confusing sort of common name. So hopefully this is clearing up some of these things a little bit. So here we have an example of a native snake showing exactly how unique and flexible their jaws are. Here we have a garter snake that is consuming a green frog. Doesn't seem to care too much about the fact that it has not killed it. And the specialization of jaws, again, is really the secret of success for all squamates and definitely snakes. So as a limbless animal, having jaws that allow them to swallow their prey whole, get it into their stomachs, is just super critical. I don't know if any of you have ever watched a snake eat. I will definitely send a video if you want to watch it of how snakes do that. When I was a kid, I used to, feed my ball python, rats, and would have little watching parties, family friends coming over to watch a snake eat, because it's a pretty amazing process if you can just get over some of the ick factor and just see how unique these jaws are and how they're able to move them independently. In the case of snakes, they don't have any connection on their lower 2 jaw bones, the maxilla there, so they can just move them independently, and they can just flex and just open and stretch incredibly wide, because of course they don't have the ability to chew up their food or cut it into pieces. They're all predators, and snakes need to swallow their prey whole. And those unique jaws are what gave them the ability to do that and evolve into all these different species that specialize on different types of prey. And the jaws really, once again, are just the key element for that to have been able to be possible. And this hopefully doesn't freak anyone out, but we've got our giant pythons that do eat very large prey. So this is a very dramatic photo of a Burmese python that is in the process of swallowing an American alligator. Now you might think, Burmese python, American alligator, wait a minute, why are they hanging out? Well, this is an example of an invasive species. The Burmese python is a fairly common snake in the pet trade, despite the fact that it grows almost 20 feet at full grown size. And in Florida, it has been released enough times that it has established wild populations, especially in the Everglades, and it's become a big problem for that ecosystem and for native wildlife, because it has the ability to consume all kinds of prey, not just, I mean, the American alligator used to be the top predator of the ecosystem, and you can see now it is being rivaled by these enormous snakes that also, of course, eat all kinds of native birds and mammals, especially a lot of threatened species. And the Everglades is such a good habitat for them. They can just hunker down, they're hard to find, and they're literally, you know, squadrons of people that go out and try to hunt them. You know, these guys hired by the government and Fish and Wildlife try to take these Burmese pythons out, but it is not an easy process. So there are some examples of where, you know, snakes have become invasive species because of their unique lifestyle, and when they find the right habitat, they can really thrive. The other story I might tell you maybe next week is the brown tree snake that got released in Guam in World War II from was hiding out fighter jets in the sort of wheel carrying sort of compartments, and then it got into this island where there were no competitors and a whole bunch of birds that didn't know how to defend themselves against snakes. So,
hey, John,
we'll get in that. Yes.
I have a question.
Yeah.
How does a snake hold on to its prey? It doesn't have any hands or anything.
Yeah.
It seems like that frog and this alligator should be able to get away.
That's a great question. So most snakes have teeth, lots of sharp teeth that curve backwards, and I'll definitely try to get a photo of that, so we, even of a snake skull and the inside of a snake's mouth. But certainly pythons and boas, they've got very sharp, curved teeth that will hold on and grip their prey. I was going to get into this next time, but another thing that really helps a lot of snakes, especially, including garter snakes, is as they're swallowing their prey, they are actually starting to slowly paralyze them with toxic saliva that slows them down as they kind of chew it into them. And so that is another sort of way that snakes can kind of, diminish the thrashing and, sort of make it easier to hold onto their prey as they're swallowing, is they're actually sedating it with toxins effectively as they're consuming it. And that's certainly the case with, the garter snake here with this green frog. Probably that frog is going off into la la land as that snake is eating it and not thrashing as much. So those are both, I think, very important adaptations for keeping the prey from getting away. But the teeth is especially important. And when you get to venomous snakes like rattlesnakes and things, they'll just nab the prey and then wait it out. They don't need to hold on to it. So they will then follow it after it's died from the envenomation, and then they can swallow it more easily. So same thing with constrict. I mean, this alligator was probably already killed with constriction before it was swallowed. Most constrictors, boas and pythons, will dispatch their prey by constricting it before they consume it. But again, garter snakes with frogs, not so much of a concern. They just kind of swallow as they feel like it. That kind of answered the question there. And so our time is doing it. We need to kind of move along to our final slides here. So I know that was kind of a creepy, big snake there. So here's a cute one. And again, I'm going to get into more details next week, but here is one of our native snake species. This is a picture I took of a little baby ring-necked snake. These guys are really common, more than you would think all across the eastern U.S., but they're pretty secretive, and you got to find them, especially in your garden, underneath rocks and logs or old decomposing tree stumps. And these guys are great little slug and snail dispatchers. So they're one of those guys that are great to have in your gardens. They're going to be earthworms too. It turns out most earthworms are invasive species. Maybe that'll be another lesson for another day. They're not as helpful as we thought they were. But these guys are great because they really just chow down on lots of these little invertebrates, and that might cause damage in your garden or overpopulate otherwise. So they're kind of quietly going about their business and are pretty darned adorable. This is a younger one, kind of more of a hatchling ring-necked snake.
John, we have a question here about snake birth. Are garter snakes the only ones who can give live birth?
Great question. I'll definitely get into snake and turtle reproduction in future classes. Quite a number of snakes are considered, they're called viviparous. There's different types of reproductive strategies. But I mean, to simplify that, basically, some snakes lay eggs and some snakes give live birth in the sense that they never develop the hard calcified shell or the leathery shell around the young, and rather the amniote membrane stays internal, which I guess is not super different than a mammal. There's no placenta, but basically, like rattlesnakes and boas and other animals will definitely have live birth, but many snakes will lay leathery eggs too. So I can definitely get into that in our next snake class and show some images and talk a little bit more about the different strategies of snake reproduction, if that's something that we want to learn more about. Hope that answers the question for now. And again, I love the questions, and sometimes it'll be maybe a chance for me to get a little more information for our next class too. So for some of these ideas, it's really helpful for me to know what people are interested in, and I would love to come back to some of these ideas even if we don't have time to dig into them today. So I think I almost am done with my slides here. So I'm going to show you a couple more just cute pictures. I mean, I saw some creepy, pythons eating alligators. So here's a little baby snapping turtle I found this spring in Peterborough, New Hampshire. One of my very favorite animals to find, whether it's a little baby or a large, multi-decade-old adult. It's just an amazing animal. I'm really looking forward to getting into our native turtles with our third class together. And that is the end of my slides for today. I just want to end on a cute note here. And I just didn't want to, try to pack too much in, so we had a little more time for some Q&A and to show you a couple little artifacts and even my little live specimen here. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and get back into the video mode. So how about this? Before I jump in with anything, are there any other questions that have popped up that we haven't had a chance to get to?
Yeah, we just got one. How do you tell an alligator from a crocodile?
Ooh, great question. Simple answer. Look at the head and the teeth. I mean, when it comes to American alligators and crocodiles, you want to look at the jaw, and the simplest thing to look for is for American crocodiles, they got that little couple bottom teeth that are kind of snaggle tooth poking out when their jaws are closed. Where American alligators, it's only from the top. It's kind of a sort of broader snout in general. Alligators have kind of broader ones, and crocodiles are usually a little more slender, kind of more of a snaggle tooth appearance. But there's many species of crocodiles that all kind of look a little bit different. So it's kind of good to think about, kind of the full diversity. But I think the easiest answer to that with the American species is just look at the snout, and the size can be a factor too. But American alligators have that broad snout with just downward pointing teeth, and the crocodiles have that kind of pointier snaggle toothed look to them. Good question. Any more?
Feel free to unmute yourself and ask John questions.
Yeah, at this point, by all means. And if not,
John?
Oh, yes.
Hi. This is wonderful. My question I had sent to Miles was, what happened in the evolution of turtles that prompted them to grow their rib cage outside? Was it predatory, or do you have any ideas?
Well, fundamentally speaking, we don't know. We can speculate, we can make guesses, but I mean, so much of ancient evolutionary history is just like, well, we can take guesses, but we really have no proof at all. But I mean, my guess is that it was defense against predators. There were, at the point of their evolution, there were a lot of big carnivorous terrestrial animals and aquatic animals, all over the place that just would chow down on little animals. And you look back at a lot of defensive features that evolved at different points in history when, for instance, and even earlier history when, you suddenly in the fossil record see all these hard shells that are evolving in prey. That was a direct response to the evolution of predators that could move around on hard jaws. My guess, speculatively speaking, is that it was a response to a lot of big predators that were out there at that time. So
thank you.
All right, well, if any other questions come in, please chime in. But as I'm waiting, I'm going to take out a real specimen. I was hoping I could catch a snake or turtle for today's class. Maybe I will for a future class to actually be able to show you. But I do have a living creature, a little guy here I'll bring out. It is a squamate. And this is, hope I can get him on the camera here. This is our little pet here. His name is Ketsy. And he is a crested gecko. And these little guys are actually, they've become pretty popular as pets, and because they're pretty easy to take care of for a reptile. And they are not a native species. There's a weird story about these guys. They are actually native to New Caledonia, an island in the Pacific. And in the wild, they're actually fairly threatened and not very well studied. But somehow, some people took a population of them captive, and they just thrived. They just did great, and they bred, and now they just have them all over the place in the pet industry, and they're just really easy to take care of. And I'm gonna hold him up there. He's doing his little licking there. There we go. He's doing his thing. So you can see his ears. Definitely a lizard. but he's a gecko, a unique family of lizards that do not, the true geckos have no eyelids. So just like other lizards we saw, they have to lick their eyeballs to keep them clean. I don't quite understand why they're evolved, to be honest, an animal like a gecko, but because they're not quite burrowing in their history like snakes will. Whoa, and they jump. So I got to hold on. We got a little activated here, but he's a fun little guy. And geckos are, you don't have any geckos native to New Hampshire. They're more of a tropical species around the world, or tropical group of species, I should say, family. But this is a true gecko in the sense that it has these very specialized toe pads that can just cling to anything. I mean, they can hold on to glass. They can, it's like these little tiny skin folds and microscopic hairs is what it is, that actually form like microscopic bonds with the molecules of the surface as they're walking. It's pretty wild stuff. And you know, they develop all kinds of biomimicry technology based on learning about that, you know, gloves. I hope they have commercially available gecko gloves available someday, but that might cause a lot of problems with, I don't know, bank robberies and stuff. Who knows?
John, here's a fun question just came in.
Yeah.
He says, why doesn't he have any friends? Doesn't he need a friend?
That's an interesting question. So, you know, generally speaking, and there are exceptions to this, and I definitely don't want to make too many wide generalizations about reptiles, because there are some very social behaviors in some reptiles, very complex ways that some reptiles will interact. So we'll talk about some of that a little bit, especially timber rattlesnakes have some really amazing things that we've learned about how they recognize each other and even follow, you know, have family groups and things like that. So we're learning more about how reptiles have social lives, but compared to mammals and birds, generally speaking, they do not need companionship or family, that sort of thing. They really just don't have, I mean, you look at even the brains of tetrapods and how they evolved, kind of, you know, have the kind of simple language of like the lizard brain and like the mammal brain, which are kind of simple terms that relate to these different layers of the brain. And as I understand it, you know, the limbic system that we share with mammals is where a lot of that emotional, social stuff really happens. And reptiles do not have a limbic system. So this is a very different lifestyle. You know, a snake, it's kind of a great pet if you don't have a lot of time to take care of it, because if it's warm and it has a place to hang out and it gets fed as long as it needs, you know, every week or so, depending on the species, and you know, you maybe make sure it has some water, you don't need to hang out with it. In fact, it's just fine doing its thing all by itself. So if anything, I'm probably the one who's annoying Ketsy by taking him out here, and he's like, I was having a nice morning, I was in my Zen mode, and now what's going on here? But I will say that there are reptiles. I would say turtles have kind of a lot of more personality, and I have definitely observed social behavior in turtles, even like with human owners, you know what I mean, like coming out to say hi. And I would say turtles have more of a social behavioral set of systems generally, but it's a complicated story. I think so much of how we understand animal social lives is limited by what we haven't learned yet, you know what I mean? And just, we don't have the tools, and it's just so different than what we're used to as mammals and humans. We kind of use our own ideas about, oh, what is a social life? How does it look? If it doesn't look what we're used to, then we kind of assume it's not there. You know, for birds and all kinds of things, learning how complex their language is, and they just have their own ways of communicating and doing what they do. And we're just kind of beginning to understand that by understanding them on their own terms. So I think that's a kind of a big lesson in study of animals and animal behavior, of really trying to get away from these old ways of kind of applying human ideas onto other species and using that as the litmus test of like, are they smart? Are they social? You know what I mean? So that's a long answer to a simple question. Generally speaking, yeah, Ketsy doesn't need to hang out. Any other questions here? So wrapping up.
We did have a question from Karen, but I think we need more details. Karen, do you want to tell us more about these critters?
Well, so my son lives in Guam. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. And so I visited there when my granddaughter was born in 1995. And there just are these little, I mean, I'm using the word lizard, but I don't know that that's the right terminology, like the geckos that can just climb the wall, and they would be inside as well as outside. Nobody paid much attention. When I was there, I did not know about the brown snake stuff, which of course is a horrible problem for the people that live in Guam. And, but I mean, I've heard that story a long time ago. But anyway, I remembered them being green. I mean, my son still lives there. I could ask him if it still happens, but do you have any idea what it mean? Would it be a gecko? Because it can literally just, you know, hang on the wall.
Yeah, my guess is it was some kind of gecko. I mean, in tropical places, there's many kinds of geckos. And honestly, if any of you have ever been to like a warm, humid place, even just Florida or American South, you probably know you've seen a very common world spread gecko species. There's this kind of this whitish, grayish little guy, the house gecko, that's originally from the Mediterranean. And they have just spread everywhere because they do great in human environments. So they hang out, in the by your lights and in your rooms, and they just, they're eating bugs, so they're really not harmful at all. But they do, they compete with native geckos and lizards, and they have some of those issues related to, introduced species. But they're just one of those animals that has happened to just ride the human society kind of train and just is benefiting from it. It just happens to be really good at cohabiting with us in our environments. But you said it was green, so it might have been a native.
I don't know.
gecko.
I mean,
Yeah.
it was almost 27 years ago. So,
But good question. But like again,
I actually will ask him to see because I'm curious.
Yeah, I will say if any of you do have photos you've had lying around of like, what was this or that reptile or things you want to share, by all means get them emailed to me or Miles, and I'll be happy to address it and talk about it in future classes. So I think we're just almost out of time, Miles. Is that about where we're at right now?
Yep.
Yeah. So how about one more cool thing I'll show you is this sea turtle shell that was hanging in the hair center. I don't know where it came from. Again, some kids are like, "Did you kill the animals that you have at the hair center?" And like, no, we didn't. We just didn't inherit them, and our native species we'll get them preserved ourselves. But this is I think from a green turtle. This one had some sort of weird asymmetry to it. It's kind of hard to see there. But the reason I'll show you real quick is you can see the scutes on it, those big flat scales that all turtles have covering the shells, and the shell is bone. It is dermal material, and you can see underneath there the vertebrae and how it's fused into the ribs, and that is how all turtle shells really look from the inside, is they're literally just part of the skeletal system. So it's a pretty amazing adaptation, and again, the evolution of that just really boggles my mind. So all right, cool. Well, I think that's all the time we have for today. Miles, do you have any final things you want to share before we say?
That was awesome, John. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining. I really enjoyed sharing this with you today, and I look forward to 2 more classes. So next week we'll have our focus on snakes and then turtles. And again, happy to answer questions, and I'll be sharing the PowerPoint with you and some other resources you guys can check out for next week. So I look forward to